I'm on the warpath against what I call top-down thinking. As we go through this, I'll be able to point out to you some much more specific issues where attractive sounding advice is the wrong advice, in my opinion. The Labor Party did not get into power in 1945 and say something like, we will bring about a well-being revolution. Now, I don't want to accuse anyone of saying that they've brought about a well-being revolution, but certainly Sophie Howe, the Future Generations Commissioner in Wales, she's arguing, and the CPD is arguing to a substantial extent, that it's this abstract noun that is giving us these insights. And I think that's a big mistake. So this is a sort of game of whack-a-mole where lots of nice sounding abstract nouns sort of float around in a cloud, and we say that we like them. And then every now and again we change the value statements, but it actually, if something went out, you wouldn't be right in assuming that now that's not a priority. In my view, you can't say that you have a value by writing out the word. You say, I can show you I have that value because when I had to trade this value against that value in this context, I chose to be honest rather than responsive. Values are revealed in their embodied form, in the way we do our work, live our lives, and so on.
Now, whether you can do that or not, I think that's where this approach falls down.
No, but that's my point. I have no doubt that you can find words in the paper that says that there are trade-offs. But if you pay close attention to the words that they use, they imply that the values are sorted out at the top and then they're somehow driven down with these clear values. And I'm saying that isn't how values work at all. Values refer to the choices we make in contexts, and particularly difficult contexts. And I think we owe it to ourselves to think in a more, if we're going to call ourselves thinkers, think tanks, all this sort of stuff, let's get our thinking caps on and not our platitude caps on.
Very good. Okay.
Welcome to another edition of Uncomfortable Collisions with Reality. This is in fact the second part of a discussion I had with Gene Tunny, which you will have seen in the previous episode. We were talking about well-being. We were talking about government attempts to improve well-being. If you like, it's really a kind of well-being agenda. And I was expressing some somewhat sceptical views about how it's being done, but not unoptimistic views about how it could be done. And in this discussion, we want to get more specific, and we're going to have a look at a specific discussion paper that has been put out by the Centre for Policy Development, and also talk about New Zealand's wellbeing budgeting, and if there's time, talk a bit about the arrangement in Wales, because Sophie Howe, the former Commissioner for Wellbeing and Future Generations in Wales, has been talking up a storm in our country, Australia, and it's worth talking a bit about that. So I will now hand over to my friend and colleague, Gene Tunny.
Oh, thanks, Nicholas. Good to be chatting with you again. I'm keen to talk to you about this CPD paper, so Centre for Policy Development, Redefining Progress, Global Lessons for an Australian Approach to Wellbeing. And it's been informed by that Wales approach, hasn't it, if I remember correctly? So it's good if we can chat about what's happening in Wales.
Yeah.
Now, I think it'd be good if we just begin just talking about what is this paper saying. I mean, in a sense, it seems pretty harmless. It's essentially just saying that there are a variety of aspects to well-being, and we should do our best to get data on those. And then I think where you may have an issue with it and where it can get controversial is, well, we need to develop a framework and get this embedded within the public service. And that's where it can be, it may be just something that can't be done, or it may be something you don't want to do. So what's what do you think the main points of this paper are, and what are your thoughts on them, Nicholas?
Well, I think what's happening is I'm on the warpath against what I call top-down thinking. Everyone is today familiar with top-down thinking because if they go away on an away day for their organisation, whether it's in the public sector, the private sector or the not-for-profit sector, they usually go on away on away days, and they usually start with questions like, where do we want to be in 5 years' time or 10 years' time? What are our values? And the idea about this is that you define all these things. You say what it is you are about. And that then you, to use the cliche, that you drill down. You then say, oh, well, we've decided we want to be the best police force in Australia. You know, you're the Victorian Police Force and you say that. Of course, you don't really know how to measure that, but it sounds like a nice thing to say. You've only got half an hour for this session or maybe an hour, and you say no, and then someone says, well, it should be the world or whatever. And this is sort of empty talk. And then you imagine that by saying that, you've actually said something, whereas you've just said, you've waved your arms around. I'm doing a lot of that now here. And so this is, I argue, a kind of anti-thinking. You imagine your thinking. You certainly can go from one step to another. You can say things like, well, how can we get anywhere if we don't have a map? And so we'll make up a map. But then if you don't have a map, imagining you have a map is a kind of anti-thinking, isn't it? It's actually going to be a lot of trouble if you proceed assuming that saying something like, we want to be the best police force, we want to be the best news agent, we want to be the best Attorney General's department in Australia or the world, that it's saying anything really at all. So I think this is actually a really big deal. I think it's infecting us quite badly in all kinds of ways, and it was largely, it didn't exist 50 years ago. If you went away, and you didn't tend to go away and talk about strategy, but if you did, you would that would start, you would do a lot more talking about stuff that you were working on. You would do stuff, it doesn't all have to be problems that come up, but problems that have come up that are nagging away at you would be important, as would be opportunities or possible opportunities that you tried to seize and couldn't seize and so on. And that would be very specific, and it would very quickly get down to areas that you thought you could do better, and then you'd have a discussion about that. And that it's remarkable how we've chased that out, and instead we've produced all these top-down thinking, all these apex statements. And I will just take you through a blog post I put up when I walked into PricewaterhouseCoopers, and I saw that their value for the day was authenticity. So PricewaterhouseCoopers in 2014 had suddenly announced that one of their 5 or 6 values is authenticity. Well, of course, if these values mean anything, if authenticity is there, something else is not there. One thing that wasn't there was the environment. So are we saying that it is more important for PricewaterhouseCoopers to be authentic, whatever the hell that means, than it is to be an environmental steward? So this is a sort of game of whack-a-mole where lots of nice sounding abstract nouns sort of float around in a cloud, and we say that we like them. And then every now and again we change the value statements, but it actually, if something went out, you wouldn't be right in assuming that now that's not a priority. Let's say we don't have honesty in there, we have responsiveness. So now we're going to be extremely responsive. We're going to reply and respond to everything very quickly, but if it's dishonest, well, who cares? It's not in the values. So we're kidding ourselves, and I think this matters. So let's go to the first way in which I think it matters in a big way. And to prepare for this, I went to ChatGPT, and I said to ChatGPT, just generate values for a well-being, a government statement about promoting well-being. These are the values it produced. equity, sustainability, prevention, community involvement, innovation, evidence-based, accountability, collaboration, transparency, health and safety. They sound fantastic. And so let's have a look at those things. Because if you pay attention, you find that these things, that there's potential tension between these values. In my view, you don't have values. You can't say that you have a value by writing out the word. You say, I can show you I had that value because when I had to trade this value against that value in this context, I chose to be honest rather than responsive. So values are revealed in their embodied form, in the way we do our work, live our lives, and so on. So here's the first point that I want to make, that if you say you want to promote well-being and you end up with lots of nice values and lots of nice things that you're going to do, you've actually glided over the very thing that is the problem. And the problem is, let's have a look at those, even at this very top level. Let's have a look at this list. We've got evidence-based and we've got innovation. Well, by definition, the very first time you innovate, it's not evidence-based, it's intuition-based, if you like. It's not something that you can be very evidence-based about. Now, in fact, that doesn't mean that innovative firms don't care about evidence. It means that they have a somewhat different approach to evidence and they want to experiment sensibly, excitingly, wisely, in a reasonably low-risk way, usually, and then they want to build evidence around those variations to their practice and so on. But that's a simple one. So that was values 5 and 6. Values 7 and 8 are accountability and collaboration. Well, any school kid knows that when they get given, in fact, my kids used to notice this very distinctly, that when they get given a joint task, then there's an accountability problem because they're going to be jointly marked on this thing and all the freeloaders in the world turn up and say, help me, can I partner with you? And that's a big deal. That's a big deal when you say to a group of, when you say to a group of bureaucrats in different departments or at different levels in government. Here in Australia, we've got Commonwealth public servants, state public servants, and local government public servants, all of whom may come from different departments with different chains of accountability. That is a non-trivial problem. So it's if we want to try to do some of those things, we need to face up to those things and embrace, get right into them, because that's where you're going to find the gold. That's where you're going to find ways forward and difficult pathways that you might be able to get through, always knowing that if it was easy, we probably would have done it already.
Well, yes. Look, I agree with you there, Nicholas. The Centre for Policy Development does seem to acknowledge there's trade-offs, don't they? I mean, from my reading of what they're saying, I mean, they write that the key difficulty is that this cannot be values neutral. It explicitly integrates the values of the government into formalised and structured decision tools. Now, whether you can do that or not, I think that's where this approach falls down.
No, but that's my point. It sounds like, and there will be, I have no doubt that you can find words in the paper that says that there are trade-offs. But if you pay close attention to the words that they use, they imply that the values are sorted out at the top and then they're somehow driven down with these clear values. And I'm saying that isn't how values work at all. Values refer to the choices we make in contexts, and particularly difficult contexts. We don't value honesty if we're not honest in difficult situations. So that's a general point. But as we go through this, I'll be able to point out to you some much more specific issues where attractive sounding advice is the wrong advice, in my opinion. Now, you don't have to go with my opinion, but given that the people who wrote this report have read all my stuff because they quote it, they haven't responded to me implicitly and explicitly in my work saying this is the wrong way to go. Anyway, I hope we'll get to that.
Okay. One thing I've been thinking about is this idea of values. And you say that 50 years ago, nobody thought like this, or that they didn't have this top-down thinking. But didn't we have governments which came in with an agenda? I mean, we had governments which were explicitly there was ideology played a more prominent role, or arguably did. And you'd have a government, say a socialist government in Britain that came in, the Attlee government, and which had a very radical agenda to transform the economy, nationalisation of industries, nationalisation of coal, creation of National Health Service. So, I mean, to me, that started with some top-down thinking about how the role of the state. They saw the role of the state as more expansive and looking after people, whereas Thatcher obviously had a different perspective, right? So I'm still struggling with this notion that this top-down thinking is something new.
So I'm referring to top-down thinking in this highly abstract way. So when the Labor Party gets into power in Great Britain in 1945, it says our plan is to build a national health service. It's going to look like this. You pay through your taxes and you get the health service, and you don't pay to go and see the doctor. We will buy the shares of the steel companies, and that's top-down thinking. That's sort of big, specific ideas. They're either good ideas or they're bad ideas. They're usually a bit of both. And what I'm saying is that the Labor Party did not get into power in 1945 and say something like, we will bring about a well-being revolution. Now, I don't want to accuse anyone of saying that they've brought about a well-being revolution, but certainly Sophie Howe has been arguing that, Sophie Howe being the ex-commissioner from the Wellbeing and Future Generations Commissioner, or she may be called the Future Generations Commissioner in Wales, she's arguing that it's this, and the CPD is arguing to a substantial extent that it's this abstract noun that is giving us these insights. And I think that's a big mistake. And I think, I don't want to do away with the word. I know there are people who say, why should governments take it as their part of their agenda to make people happy? And I kind of agree with that, but I think that's a misunderstanding. I think that well-being is the well-being agenda is saying it's not all about the economy, and anyway, the economy is to be thought of as to give us the means to lead flourishing lives, and then we should be looking at where lives are least flourishing and trying to think about whether or not we can improve those things. And if we want to do that, I think we have to be specific, not at the top, not the Prime Minister, but in the nature of the programs. What we have to do is we have to be able to tell a story in which there is some continuity between these nice sounding words and a process which has solved problems that have proven difficult for us in the past, and therefore has delivered what is promised on the packet up here. And we don't see that sort of thinking. We see much more. We see a whole lot of other things going on, which I summarise in terms like, well, counterfeiting is one of them, and we'll talk about that with regard. I've already mentioned, I think, in our previous discussion, the Australian Treasury's wellbeing framework. That's a counterfeit framework. And just to cut to the chase, we might want to talk about that a bit. And reskinning. And reskinning is you basically end up doing what you were doing anyway, and you get a new bunch of words to describe them and a new set of KPIs and so on. Gotcha.
Okay. Now, you're very critical.
Actually, I'll just give you another very specific example. I used to be on the Council of the National Library, the Australian National Library, effectively its board. And we had, I think, 4 what were called strategic priorities, and they were things like protecting and sharing Australian stories. It was something like that. Now, there was a fourth strategic priority, and that strategic priority was excellence in everything we do. That's a nice priority. It's a sort of non-priority because it's everything. But what would then happen is that the corporate plan of the organisation or any action item would then be identified as would always have a place in any of these, in the strategic priorities. And of course, if one didn't fit 1, 2 and 3, it always fitted 4. Excellence in everything we do. Everything went into there. Everything fitted in there. So if we, we want to justify a new accounting system, a new this, new training, well, we'll stick it in there, unless we can stick it in the other ones. Now, there's no great harm in doing that, but this was partly to fit in with the PGPA Act, and you might be able to help me with the acronym. I'm not sure I will be able to, but it was a big new act, and finance had imposed upon all the government agencies the need to set out a plan with strategic priorities and show how everything was expressed in those strategic priorities. So a reskinning took place. So finance takes a bow and says it's made everything more programmatic, and we were just and insofar as we wanted to embrace some new strategic priority, we would articulate that, and then but the rest of it was just all mopped up in a way that that just reskinned it, and so we've imagined that we've done something that we haven't. Now that's quite harmless, but even if it might take a bit of time and it might be a bit ponderous and pretentious, and those things, in my opinion, actually do have a cost. But I can show you in the CPD paper. Well, look, let's get onto it then. I can show you in the CPD paper how this works and how it ends up at a place that I think is actually tells you to do the wrong thing. So on page 8, what happens when you've got these? Big top-down agendas is that they're extremely abstract. So you send people away to go. The next thing you do is you learn from international experience. So it's a whole lot of people doing the same thing, and they come up with plans, and then you report the plans, and you either use the term best practice when you've got no idea whether it's best practice. I mean, how would you know? What you know is that a bunch of people are saying, you watch those people, they're pretty smart. Or you don't even use the word best practice, you just use these things in examples. So the 4 things that, it's not on page 8, it's on, it's on page 13. So the 4 things that the CPD claim to glean out of the international experience is this. Now firstly, just notice how kind of little these things add, because they're just obvious. First one, data should be timely. No kidding. Even though the paper itself quotes Bhutan and can't give you anything from Bhutan since 2009. I think I'm right in saying that. 2, it should be possible to disaggregate data. 3, there should be some consistency of measures and goals between jurisdictions. 4, any framework should reflect data gaps and uncertainty. Now, I don't think that says very much. It's the sort of advice you get from people who are doing their best and don't quite know what they're doing. But if we pay closer attention, point 3, there should be some consistency of measures and goals between jurisdictions. I think that is a major problem, because if we're going to learn to improve well-being, we need people out in the community building programs that pay more attention to well-being, adapting programs, let's say remedial teaching in schools or whatever, to target well-being. And if they're going to do that, they don't want to be told by the Department of Finance or Treasury that here are the measures. They need measures that are causal measures. The whole thing here is that they don't say the most important thing for the data is to get data, to get information about how to improve well-being. You remember we talked last time about the New Zealand Treasury, who'd put in a Herculean effort to build a whole lot of information about about well-being. But at the end of all this exercise, it didn't reflect on how to improve well-being. So so for me, I want to use this process to authorise people out in the community, hopefully, and speaking of the top-down point, hopefully in some kind of communication with their peers and with head office, or with with central agencies and so on, to build these things. If central agencies wanted to be helpful, and this is my model of the Evaluator General, if they wanted to be helpful, they would be helping to skill up these organisations in the field to help them build some data, build some monitoring and evaluation tools that would help them improve well-being. They would proceed, and then of course it's sort of obvious that other things being equal, we'd like things to be comparable, but other things are not equal. So I would argue that we should target, that our priority should be building programs that are showing real promise where we didn't have them before, or if you like, validating with well-being measures programs that we think work in certain ways, and then go and start to show some curiosity about the way they affect well-being. The other thing you can do is, in the lateral economics, the Herald Age Lateral Economics Index of Wellbeing, we built a quick and dirty means by which you can say that you can talk about well-being dollars. In other words, you can say, if you increase somebody's well-being from a self-assessed level of 7 to 8, this is worth, you would have to give them this amount of money to do that with money. Now, that doesn't mean you can't budget with that, but you can measure with that, and you can then start to say which of the programs that we've got are having the biggest impact on well-being. But you haven't done that by making all of their KPIs comparable. You have, at the very lowest level, you've got an extremely, all you've agreed on is a kind of questionnaire. So you say, measure this from 1 to 7 or 1 to 10 or something, and then you try and encourage everybody to do it from 1 to 10. I wouldn't even force them to do that initially. And then as people get more experience, as they get more capability, then you start to introduce this business of comparability of data. But you do that always knowing that the really important thing is improving well-being, and you would never want to compromise that just so that you've got a nice-looking dashboard.
Right. So do you think this Centre for Policy Development paper, is this a good indication of what the government is likely to put out? Because the Australian government is going to put out a wellbeing statement after the budget measuring what matters. Is that why you're focused on this?
I think that's, the indications are that that's the way they're thinking at the moment. There is plenty of time to improve that. I've been talking to at least one state government, and they sort of said to me, the people I spoke to who were in a central agency, they sort of looked at me helplessly and said, but they want a framework. And I think I said this to you in our last conversation. Yeah. I told them, this is a framework. It's a framework to do something rather than a framework to measure something. And the measurement is done to help us achieve an objective. And so that's so I think I would expect, from what I've seen of the federal government's discussion paper and so on, I would expect it to be very much in the of the kind that I've critiqued here. But there's plenty of time for us all to turn that around. There's plenty of time for NGOs, communities to say there's a better way to do this. Unfortunately, lobbying usually, people are. What's hard, I think, is to have real thought embodied in lobbying, because lobbying tends to be, well, I want that. If you give me that, I'm happy. And then the politicians are trying to keep people happy, and they change a few things here and a few things there, and they don't get to an improved state of the world. So So that's the challenge. That's the challenge for those people in government at both the bureaucratic and political level to try and allow community debate and development to clarify and lift our understanding of what we're trying to do. And also, of course, it's important for governments to understand this, but it's much more important for communities to understand it and go so they can actually go and do good things.
I'd like to ask about what's happening in Wales. Yep. They've actually passed a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So in 2015, they Wellbeing of Future Generations Wales Act 2015, and it set out a set of goals that it requires all public bodies to respect, I suppose, or to follow to the extent they can. Now, I guess some of them I read them and they're generally fairly benign, and they're the sort of thing that it's hard to argue against. But there's this issue of trade-offs, and then you have to ask, well, how useful are these goals? So a prosperous Wales, a resilient Wales, a healthier Wales, a Wales of cohesive communities, a Wales of vibrant culture and thriving Welsh language, a globally responsible Wales. And they've got some text describing broadly what those things are, but it's all very general. Is that the concern you have, that, you're just doing this meaningless exercise, really, and you're creating a framework, and it doesn't really help solve the challenges that you're facing? Is that your main concern with it, or do you think it could have...
I think I'd put it a little differently. In the case of Wales is, I think, 3 million people. I might have got that number wrong. I read it somewhere. It's a small part of the UK with a degree of autonomy, and it is strongly left of centre. So you have, and this is from memory, it may be slightly wrong, but it's roughly right. I think that you've got 30 Labor. This is in the local assembly, which has got a cool Welsh name, Syned or something. And you've got 30 Labor members, 19 Conservative members, and then another 13 or 19 maybe Welsh nationalists. I won't try and pronounce the name of that party. Actually, I will, but I don't even have it written out. But it's Plaid Cymru, which spelt Cymru. So there you are. It's kind of cool. So I think what's happening is a little bit like what's happening with what happened with Jacinda Ardern, is that you have a comfortably, I would add, if somewhat blandly, left-leaning government, and the wellbeing agenda becomes a nice, cool new word to use to address these agendas. And Sophie Howe, the ex-commissioner, describes a situation where they were going to build a huge new motorway or freeway. It was going to take up most of the borrowing capacity of the government, and with the help of her own efforts, according to her, and I'm not trying to draw them into question, just make it clear that I'm relying on her, with the help of her and the community, they turned this around, and it turned into lots more bicycle paths and public transport and things. Whether that's a good thing or not, I'm happy to believe that it is. I might also say that I'm pretty sympathetic with most of this stuff, but I think it's a mistake to dress it up with new language, and it's certainly not. I think it certainly doesn't provide real clarity as to what's going on. So let me just read you from the CPD paper, because this is the problem of what I call, well, if you go into this area, if you believe the critique I've offered, then you have to realise that lots of things that look good aren't good. They're not. Nor are they bad. They're sort of nothing. And so one of the things that the paper says is that, of course, if you're providing guidance, then that guidance needs to be specific. So this is what the CPD says, and then it quotes one of the goals of a prosperous Wales as an example of what it says. Now, what it says is the it's important to set and publish well-being objectives that are, quote, designed to maximise their contribution to achieving each of the 7 well-being goals, and to take all reasonable steps to meet these objectives. These well-being goals are more than domain categories. They contain with them detail, stress that word, detail, to clearly guide the kinds of approaches that need to be taken to meet Wales's well-being objectives. For example, the CPD goes on, one goal, a prosperous Wales, is stated as follows: an innovative, productive and low-carbon society which recognises the limits of the resources efficiently and proportionately, brackets including acting on climate change, and which develops a skilled and well-educated population in an economy which generates wealth and provides employment opportunities, allowing people to take advantage of the wealth generated through securing decent work. Well, and where do you start? I mean, everyone says that. Does this mean that it's extremely difficult to see how this is specific advice? It's the opposite of specific advice. It's general. It's very general advice. So that now what's my critique? Well, when this has been authorised by the legislature and it gets itself a commissioner, and the commissioner has some statutory independence to harass the government, then at least you know that it's kind of fairly serious. It's trying to do something. So I don't want to argue that this commission has been a waste of time. I don't know. I do think it's reasonable to say that we don't know, and not much effort has been put into working out what of these things would have happened with and without that organisation. But it's certainly, it's straight Edmund Burke, the father of conservatism, to say that we want to build into our political system concern for future generations. Absolutely standard stuff. And so I think in principle this sounds like a good idea. But imagine with this, saying that we want to sell this to the New South Wales government, and the New South Wales government wants to sell it to Western Sydney. Well, Western Sydney wants motorways. Western Sydney wants tollways if necessary, freeways if possible, to give it reasonable travelling opportunities into the city. And that will be the fact. That will be the Western Sydney votes and the Commission doesn't vote. So I'm quite wary of pretending that by saying nice things we can change those things. I want to work within the realities that are given to us, and then to do great things by trying to find ways to connect communities into opportunities to improve their own communities. And we spoke a bit about that in the last conversation we had when we talked about some of the programs, intergenerational anti-loneliness programs and all kinds of things, and spoke about trying to come up with a cost curve. And what's a cost curve? It's causal data. It's saying if you spend this amount of money or if you do this, you'll get this much benefit in terms of well-being. That, I think, could be useful anywhere. Whereas this other thing is playing kind of linguistic footsies with the fact that people will vote in certain ways, and now we're going to pretend that that's really consistent with a whole bunch of other things that we've said are good.
CPD is arguing for community-centred governance connected to national priorities. So do you have an issue with that? I mean, could that be that interface that you were talking about? They want locally led governance structures.
It sounds fine. So let's build the institutions. If they want to do that, then the paper should show you some areas, well researched, so we don't think that someone's just done a literature review and swallowed everybody's propaganda. They can say, look at what they've done in Mount Isa. That's what they've done. This seems to work, and this is the way you will tell if it is working in the next 3 or 4 years, and we will check that. How have they done it in Mount Druitt? How have they done it in Toorak? So don't talk about it as if we know how to do this stuff. The fact is we don't. And as I was saying to you earlier before we started, I think one of the great issues for government all around the world. One of the many things, or few things, but big things that is tearing the world apart is that the interface between the world of systems, the world of power, the world of bureaucracy, and the life world of citizens, the life world of community, is very dysfunctional. And therefore, it suffers from elite domination. And in a sense, in a very soft sense, this is elite domination. It's mostly just nice sounding words. But that's the problem that we need to solve. There are plenty of promising initiatives in the field which show ways in which we can put these things together. But they don't come out of grand discussion papers about a national plan, or rather, what they would do is they'd say, here's a national plan, let's get together and let's do all these things in the field, and then in 2 years' time we'll work out what we've achieved, what we haven't achieved, and we'll keep building towards that plan, rather than imagining that it can all be sorted at the level of expressions of intent by the people at the top of these systems. That is basically a recipe for government by amnesia, going round and just endlessly reskinning the mess that we have at the moment.
Right, yeah. Okay. And what about New Zealand? You've been critical of what they've done as well.
Yeah, so I think New Zealand is a good example, and here I might just use an expression of Bill Easterly. So Bill Easterly is a development economist who, I think, like quite a lot of people, they start, I mean, the way they would characterise it, I'm not that sympathetic with his pretty right-wing now, or at least very, very fond of markets. But I think a lot of these people start out being they think of themselves as starting out naive, left of centre, liberals in the American sense. And he coined the expression, the cartel of good intentions. Wonderful expression. And what it means is that imagine you're trying to help, you're giving aid to a country in Africa, and you hand over all this money, and some of it gets stolen, some of it doesn't work, some of it makes things worse, some of it does work. Now, if you report this honestly, your sources of funding are going to dry up. You're going to demoralise all these people who are on your side, sort of essentially for ideological and moral reasons, not because they actually, they'd like the world to be better. Just that it isn't. So what's happened here is that, Richard Layard, I mentioned him yesterday, there's his book, Happiness, in which he's one of the people who raised this wellbeing agenda. And so when Jacinda Ardern says, I want to have a wellbeing budget, he's applauding because I'm not being critical of him. He's applauding because he thinks that he wants people to talk like this. And he's not saying what I'm saying, which I think is also worth saying, which is that that Jacinda Ardern's wellbeing budgeting, I expect it will be gone within 5 years. It might be gone now she's gone. And that is the way and that is closely tied with the fact that it was not a wellbeing budget, it was a wellbeing themed budget. What's the difference? Well, I think it was a wellbeing themed budget in the same way that a ball that is themed pirates is a pirate's ball. So what happened is that Jacinda Ardern says, I like this word wellbeing. They should be familiar with the New Zealand Treasury work on it. I would like, so let's make the budget about wellbeing. So then what happens is not the sort of things we've been talking about, not someone saying, in a year or two's time, we're going to tell you which of our programs have generated the most wellbeing dollars, and which of the new programs are starting to really ramp that up, so we're getting lots more wellbeing among our carers and our dyslexic kids and our autistic kids and our people in aged care homes and our kids who are lonely in schools and so on. Instead, what we hear, it's done by, and I'm not joking, it's done by word association. So the New Zealand wellbeing budget has 5 themes. Important word, themes. These are themes which sound like well-being. Well, they start by sounding like well-being related. They then sort of fade off into things that don't sound particularly well-being related, but they're themes and governments, and they sound nice, and those 5 themes are improving child well-being, supporting mental health, backing Maori and Pacifica, backing Indigenous folks, creating opportunities. That's getting rather vague and general, and you would hope appear in non-wellbeing budgets, and boosting innovation. So those are the 5 themes. So we're not building any real capacity to see something in new ways. We're relying on all the old ways we see things. We're saying now we're going to spend more money on child development, child education, child distress, and so on. I think that's great. But it's not, anyone could have done that in the last 100 years, especially left of centre governments, and it is not taking us anywhere with regard to well-being. Just to back up and justify my point about the well-being agenda coming and then going, and then we'll get a new word, resilience or social inclusion. Oh no, sorry, they've already come, but we'll come up with a new word. The reason that it is so easy for them to be blown away after 5 or 10 years in the highlights is that they haven't put down any roots in the community. No one's saying, yes, this agenda, we should be governing in certain areas, we should be governing for well-being. This is a way we've built a much better way to govern ourselves. And I think if you could do that, if you then the community would own that, and an incoming opposition or even an incoming leader from the same party would want to show some continuity with that.
Nicholas, the way I'd summarise what you're saying, and this is this is probably too glib, but you're basically saying more action, less talk. I mean,
yeah, that sounds good.
Get on with it, finding those actual opportunities to improve well-being rather than just talking about well-being and
more action,
preparing frameworks.
More action, less talk. More field work, less top talk. More focus on capability. Another one is more candour. We cannot learn how to do this stuff if we don't have systems that tell themselves the truth, let alone tell the public the truth. And these are systems that are constantly taking what I call is the off-ramp from reality. It's why this podcast is called Uncomfortable Collisions with Reality. We have to embrace a collision with reality. We have to say, we have to invite the discomfort of all the ways that we don't know how to do things so that we can slowly and methodically and persistently try to learn how to do these things that we claim to want to learn how to do. And I think we do want to learn how to do. The question is, do we want to learn how to do them enough to make ourselves uncomfortable? That's the question.
Did you say you want to take an off-ramp from reality?
I'm saying that all of these things do take the off-ramp from reality. They don't look the reality in the eye. They don't say, but we've tried to do this and it hasn't worked. Why hasn't it worked, and how could we make it work? We don't do that. I came across this in another government document quite recently, and I should have maybe taken it down to discuss, but again and again, we have a relaunch of an old program. That's fine. That's true of Closing the Gap, by the way, which revived an agenda of the Hawke government. But nobody says, we're now reviving this agenda. It failed last time. We think it failed for these reasons. These are the ways we're going to avoid those failures. This is why we're optimistic. And this is how you'll be able to tell whether we're succeeding or not in the next 2 or 3 years. We don't get any of that. We get all the nice talk at the aspirational level, and that is taking the off-ramp from reality because it makes us all complicit in this idea that by having a good intention, that intention will be realised. And that intention needs to be worked on. We need to be honest with ourselves about what we've succeeded at, what we've failed at, how we're learning, and so on.
Okay, and this is why you have the idea of the Evaluator General, who has a statutory responsibility to evaluate government programs and to work out what the good ones are, what the bad ones are, and to provide, so we get better programs that actually deliver.
That's one way to explain it, But you'll note that I mentioned it earlier on, and I mentioned it rather with the point of view of, with the perspective, rather to try to resource people in the field, because evaluation is quite a complex thing and there's a lot of expertise in it. And so, and it's fundamental that you don't evaluate to make yourself feel good. As Richard Feynman said, the first rule in science is you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. So it's a critical friend. It's a person who's got some expertise, who's going to help hold your feet to the fire. But I don't want to make this a heroic story. It's just being honest with yourself and also trying to mobilise your good intentions and have them turn into good outcomes. That's a hard process, and we've only got to the stage of talking about our good intentions and assuming that the good outcomes will flow, and we've been doing that for 40 years.
Yeah. One thing I would add, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, to me this well-being framework and the measuring what matters and all that, it partly reflects a technocratic mindset. There's this idea that if we get enough data, and I mean, I'm not objecting to data. I like data, I mean, I like analysing data. But there's this idea that if we just get enough data and we analyse it, then we can come up with the optimal solution. Yeah. And to a large extent, in many areas, that's just not possible. You're not going to be able to.
It's completely not true. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to mobilise local agency, both at the individual and community level, and that's what we need to do. Not just talk about it, but to try and realise that that's a hard thing to do. That in many ways we're putting more and more obstacles in the way. And in fact, one of the things that when we were talking about the top-down thinking earlier, we spoke another thing we talked about was so we had so remember that list of all those values that ChatGPT generated for us, and they're very realistic. Most people would recognise that's the sort of thing that gets produced. I don't think ChatGPT is quite this level of genius, but I've just realised that there are three times where pairs of values are actually in tension with each other, which it hasn't you just have to go from one to the next one. So one is prevention and the other is community involvement. So what do we do? What do we do with community programs? Well, if they've got anything to do with children in any form, I think even over Zoom, but I might be wrong about that, then we need police checks. Because why? Well, the official story is we're trying to protect children from predators. Of course, we should be trying to do that. There are many ways to do that, and and ticking that box is in some ways a way not to do that, because once we've ticked it, everyone says, "Oh, we don't have to worry about that anymore." So an evaluator general, or if we had resources in the community keeping people's mind on the fact that there are tensions here, and then we want to make responsible experiments to see how we can keep children safe in ways that don't produce a bureaucratic wall for people to get involved. Because remember, I haven't yet seen the data on this. I've certainly heard anecdotal stories about this from a number of people, that if you're volunteering, you've got a really very limited preparedness to go through one damn hoop after another. I hate those things. And you fill in forms, then you have to do it all over again, sometimes every 3 months, sometimes every year. And so that is actually harming the ability of the community to self-organise and solve its problems. So we need a system that notices that, tells us that, and then strategises around that. Those are the things that would be happening if we wanted to build a wellbeing agenda.
Yeah, this might be a topic for another conversation. Because we're coming to. I think we're nearly at the end. But I just in terms of the blue check, it'd be
the blue check. Blue check.
Is it the blue check for working with children?
A police check.
Yes. Okay. I think that's what it is, and I think that may be what we call it here in Queensland.
Yeah.
I couldn't imagine any government, any premier, changing the rules on that now because they'd just be so worried about any risk. They just want to completely avoid any, because there could be an instance where there is an awful incident, and then someone says, "Oh, well, that's because you changed that rule there." So
that's right.
So that politicians they're very risk averse about certain things.
That's right. So we do a number of things. Firstly, we're explicit about that, and we say we can't see this changing. We also say which communities would like to experiment with some variation on this, some very minor variation on this. The other thing we do is we say if we've got a wellbeing agenda, we want to do what is, I understand now, happening at the Australian government level, which is we want a system of automatic notification. So I don't have to have a police check. So I give a number to the service provider, and the service provider verifies the number and checks on the system, and then says that the moment I get done in by the moment I get reported as having done something of concern, that the program is immediately gets an email the next day. So that is much less damaging to community development, and in fact performs this role far better at the same time. So yes, there are always things you can't do, and there are often things you can do, but you have to notice them. And this kind of stuff, again, it's a very good example of the sort of problems we're having this debate in the trans community at the moment, because we seem to think that we can solve difficult problems which will be solved somewhat differently in different communities according to different understandings, with slogans issued by high-level politicians and community activists, and it isn't working. It's one of the, speaking of Wales, well, it was one of the things that did in Nicola Sturgeon, who said that women were women, and then what was to all intents and purposes a man and a rapist was sent, who identified as a woman, was sent into a women's prison. So that's why slogans and top-line comments are very often in these kinds of areas that they either add value, they add no value and appear to add value, or they actually do harm in ways that I've outlined with regard to the wellbeing agenda.
Okay, I think that's a good spot to end, Nicholas. I think you've really, you really critiqued the CPD paper, and I mean, what they've done is interesting. I think it's good that they've made this contribution, and this is their thinking on wellbeing and how it might be applied in Australia. And you're not necessarily. I mean, there's stuff in there absolutely, that's fairly non-controversial. That's good stuff.
Right.
But the way that they're proposing to implement it, you just think, well, maybe that's not the right way to go about it. If you're interested in well-being, focus more at the local level, and finding those opportunities to improve well-being. Right?
Yeah, think hard and don't sell platitudes, because a lot of the platitudes are, at the very least, unhelpful, but in fact sometimes actively misleading. Realise that you're trying to do something difficult, something that lots of people have, kind of sounded enthusiastic about and ended up empty-handed. So that's part of the problem you're trying to solve. I think that here's a prediction. I think that the wellbeing budgeting in New Zealand will not be there, probably even in name, in 5 years' time. I would argue it, but that's partly because it's never been there. It's really just been a badging exercise, and I think we owe it to ourselves to think in a more. If we're going to call ourselves thinkers, think tanks, all this sort of stuff, let's get our thinking caps on and not our platitude caps on.
Very good. Okay, Nicholas Gruen, thanks for the chat. That's been great.
Thanks, Gene.